Welcome viewers. For this video I want to have a bit of a talk about the Steel Judoka squad in the video game Into the Breach. I feel like this squad is quite misunderstood and a lot of people struggle with it for a number of different reasons. If you look at some of the Steam community discussions, you can see it's a common topic, and I will admit that I too had a big learning curve with it. On one spectrum you have the newer players who feel like they hit this really big wall in their quest to complete all the squads, and the fewer experienced players who often either give bad advice or otherwise unhelpful. I'm hoping that this video will help close that gap so you too can have fun with it. It's important for me to point out that as of right now, I only play on normal mode. I don't play on hard as it is too much for me. However, I'm also extremely confident that the practices I advise in this video will carry over just fine to hard if you do play on that presently or in the future. On that same note, you will see me do lots of the 3 reward missions, and I do train missions all day long. Gotten lots of 20k runs on every squad, with 4 islands being my usual run, so it's not like I'm a total wimp. The next point is that what I advise or recommend is something that I have tried and used repeatedly with reliable success, which means that it is proven to work. It doesn't mean that you will have perfect islands every time with 0 grid damage, but rather considerably higher chances of success. I also have my own style, which may or may not be congruent with your own. So take mine as a starting point and then change whatever suits your style and go from there. At this point, I will give the standard too long didn't watch part that some of you might ask for. Select Mantis or Herald without grid defense and put that pilot into gravity mech. First pod power core goes into artillery movement. First 3 cores from the store goes into max artillery. Get a good primer pin ASAP at all costs and sell VEC hormones. There you go. Now we can move on to this video to how to make this squad pop. One of the first things I want to clear up about this squad is that it is quote unquote hard. I'm going to say yes in a way because I struggled with them very hard when I got to them the first time, so I know the feeling, and did a bunch of research, tried a lot of different things, and piled on the hours to figure out the squad. People said to put Prospero in the prime, Sultan in the artillery, Mantis in the prime, use VEC hormones. And I tried all of these and more and could not get them to work reliably. I ended up fully committing to figuring out a way to make them work and forcing myself to play them until I figured out a strategy for pilots and upgrades that was reliable and repeatable. After all, you want to have fun with this game, showing off elite PvE moves to impress your mates with. I often heard talk of this squad being really hard. Well, I'm going to go on a bit of a long tangent here, but many of you have likely played FTL faster than light. If you want hard, all I can say is set the difficulty to hard, load up the Stealth B and roll out. This ship is vulnerable to just about everything. Asteroid fields, because no shields. Beam weapons, because no shields. Ion storms, because high power weapon that takes 18 seconds to charge and is easily disabled. Plasma storms, because the high power weapon can easily be pushed offline. Boarding events, because it only has a 2-man medbay stuffed in a corner, so you can't vent the whole ship and shuffle crew around keeping them alive. Enemies with fast fire weapons can knock out your high power beam weapon before you have a chance to use it. They can knock out your engines, that whole no shield thing again, or cloak, or piloting, and easily dumpster the ship. But if you struggle long enough, you can eke out an existence, but that also requires that you buy shields, flak to support your high power beam weapon, upgrade the cloak to level 3, which is the first thing you have to do, grab hacking and mind control for support, all of which is extremely expensive and has so many ways it can go wrong. But when it does work, like what you see in this saved game instance, which was part of my only victorious hard run, it can be pretty awesome. This of course is not the only ship that is difficult to win on hard consistently. There is also the Federation C, Stealth C, Rock A, and so on. In general, the Steel Judoka squad isn't as hard as this stuff. I want to compare the Steel Judoka to the Stealth A. Although it may not look like much, it's actually a low-key super good ship for winning on hard. It's not as over the top as the Crystal B or the Mantis B. Of those, I give the advantage to the Crystal B, as the Crystal boarders have the superior advantage in boarding control, like this. Super scary ship goes up, you board its weapons, maybe cloak a shot, and the weapon system is offline and he's done. You can even board Lanius ships with this. Talk about spooky. But anyways, the Stealth A just needs flak 1 first at all costs, then buy shields, then hacking and mind control, and you're set. You might snicker at the mini beam and the dual lasers being used in the boss fight, but make no mistake, these are fast firing weapons that are extremely power efficient. Once you get the hang of how to use this ship, it is a surprisingly effective ship for winning, and winning a lot. I will say that FTL nurtured two distinct emotions for me. One is a burning hatred for missile launchers, and two, the uncorked satisfaction of watching a formerly overpowered ship burn out. Another game that has some parallels to Into the Breach is Warhammer 40k Mechanicus. A rather solid game actually, and goes off turn by unit, not turn by side. It's got some issues, fair number actually, but it's a great ambassador of the Warhammer 40k franchise with a solid soundtrack, great atmosphere, no excess DLC faff or ripoffs typical of the 40k brand in general. It's a slower paced game and also lacks a lot of the polish, simplicity, and refinement of Into the Breach. But if you're a fan of Into the Breach and or the Warhammer franchise, you should definitely check it out. I'll leave a short review and thoughts about this game if you decide to pick this game up in the appendix. I also really like the way they did the death marks. It really leaves you with the impression of power and projection. So what does this have to do with the Steel Judoka? Well, you can't just brute force your way around the game with a Stealth A in FTL, and neither with the Steel Judoka in Into the Breach. It requires craftiness, game knowledge, and smart play to thrive, which makes it a popular squad choice for players who play a lot on hard mode. In hard mode, you are more or less guaranteed an alpha enemy at the start, one extra enemy, and a higher chance of alpha enemies in successive turns, meaning that with higher enemy hit points, you can't always kill everything each and every turn to stay ahead of the damage race. Therefore, you have to use positioning and blocking to get ahead. Now let's get on to the rest of the point of this video. The first part is to talk about the pilots, the second is talking about the upgrades and upgrade path I like to use, and the last part is a narrated playthrough of 2 islands that I'll walk you through how I like to do it. A time traveler is a pilot that you can pick at the end of a campaign to carry over to the next mission, if you so desire. The choice of which pilot to bring is built on a variety of factors, such as squad, playstyle, testing and experimentation, and suitability for future operations. With that in mind, some pilots are more flexible and useful than others, and there are many pilot tier lists and evaluations done by others. Under ideal circumstances, a time traveler with good bonuses is brought along to either compensate for a particular vulnerability or to significantly amplify a mech or even an entire squad's effectiveness. Let's start with a basic review of pilots. If this does not match up to pilot options available after July of 2022, this is because a near future update will introduce pilots that I do not have present access to. Anyways, first up is Ralph. He doesn't really do anything special or even necessary, and I will only pick him if a default mech pilot rolls grid defense and this fellow comes along who happens to not have grid defense. Camellia is one of my favorite mech pilots. She really does well in prime positions, such as this combat mech, lightning mech, judo mech, and so on, as her immunity to Vec webs is rather underrated. You'll find that every island has at least one type of control Vec: Scorpion, Leaper, or Spider. The ability to temporarily disregard or bait such an enemy and instead reposition to attack from a different angle or different enemy in a more favorable position is very powerful, as the Prime tends to be a mech that likes to be up front, close in, and a central part of the squad's effectiveness. A lot of folks like to use her in the jet mech of the Rusting Hulks, and she's a great fit for that, but I've also done many runs without having her and done just fine. Instead, as a time traveler choice, I recommend the Tascam the Mantis in the Pulse mech. This subject will be expanded on in my next video, so check my other video which will cover positioning, pilot choices, and upgrade paths soon after this one is released. Next we have Lily. Like some of the other pilots in this lineup, she's better than a default mech pilot, and the bonus is better than not having it, but there are better choices. The same goes for Isaac, Bethany, and Chen. Henry could be a solid substitute for Camellia. He's not bad, but he's not an A-tier pilot either. Abe is a solid choice for the charge mech of the Zenith Guard and the unstable mech of the hazardous mechs. Anytime I find him, I put him in those spots regardless of whether he has grid defense or not, because he makes a significant improvement in their survivability. Harold is an A-tier pilot, and while his special ability may not look like much from this pilot lineup, it actually is very powerful and easily contends at the top. I will explain more on this in a moment. Onto the cyborg pilots. Ghana is unfortunately rather uninteresting. I have tried many times to use him in an offensive manner to quickly gain aggro or initiative early. I never really found him all that great. On top of that, if you get a red blood scion, then before the turn begins, the 1 damage that he does to enemies is negated unless you kill it outright, of which the only enemy with 1 hit point is a regular leaper. And killing 1 leaper on the first turn is better than not doing it, but is also not that significant in the longer run. Archimedes is a great pilot, another A-tier pilot who excels in prime positions and artillery, and you can do other things with him too. The ability to take a dangerous, if not future fatal shot, and then reposition to an advantageous position for the next turn is not to be underestimated. If you do choose this pilot, make sure you pick +1 reactor and +2 hit points, so that you can use his ability immediately on the first turn of the first mission of the first island. Otherwise, he loses out on a significant part of his effectiveness and the ability to be able to block after attacking. Silica is an endgame pilot who can do some fun things. He doesn't really shine all that well because his ability is expensive and only really practical on Island 4 because you won't have enough upgrades to make him useful. However, his ability to park next to buildings with a lightning mech and delete the entire grid by himself is quite notable. And if you get the opportunity to toss him into the combat mech of the Riftwalkers with Dash online, it is a lot of fun and can solve a lot of late game damage problems. Prospero is basically a more expensive version of Henry or Camellia, and I generally will put him into an artillery role, but I do not choose him outright as a time traveler. Next we have the alien pilots. Starting with Tascam the Mantis, this is probably the most versatile and capable pilot in the game, and as of right now can fit very well into 7 out of 8 squads in the game. Simply hop into a specific mech and he will make it outright better. You can put him into the defense mech of the Zenith Guard, and suddenly it can block for a turn or 2 without dying, and has 2 damage plus push. You can put him into the gravity mech of the Steel Judoka, and now you have 3 damage mechs instead of 2. You can put him into the ice mech, and now instead of the option of freezing yourself and 1 enemy each turn, you can now kill something else if you like. You can put him into the pulse mech, the hook mech, and they also gain damage, which they did not have before. You can put him into the swap mech, and now you can either teleport enemies or kill them outright. You can put him into the nano mech, and now you can either push something and put acid onto it, or you can just kill it instead. When you start goofing off with random and custom squads, that's when this fellow really starts to become a star of the show. Another cool thing he can do is the so-called carrier mech, where you take a acid tank and a light tank, although you could probably use other tanks, and you put them on a character or mech that normally doesn't do all that much, such as the hook mech of the Blitzkrieg squad. And what basically happens with that is, although it's a bit of a late game option, you can launch 2 tanks and then you still have a mech that can block or do 2 damage to any one particular enemy. And it's kind of a fun thing to experiment with. Moving on to this Rockman, unfortunately she doesn't really do anything outstanding, and that's fine. If you wanted to put her in the prime spot of the Flame Behemoth so you can sell flame shielding in exchange for something else, that would be reasonable. You can also substitute for Abe if you like, but otherwise I would not pick this FTL Wedding Bride for a time traveler. Lastly, we have Mafan the Zoltan. He, or it, whichever it is also a really popular top tier choice because you can immediately dump 2 power into a key upgrade. You gain a shield each turn if it goes down, so a number of people like to use him for certain spots. Now, a number of people like to use him in the siege mech of the Steel Judoka specifically. The issue that I have with that is that just bumps up the base damage of the artillery from 1 to 2, which is a good upgrade, but without the buildings immune, it doesn't really do all that much. Having Herald or the Mantis in the gravity mech tends to be an overall better choice because you're giving the gravity mech something else to do other than just a token pull effect that is not really all that useful in the larger scope. So I'm not going to say it's not going to work, it's just that the other options tend to be stronger and more reliable at addressing the squad's weak points. A lot of people will use them in the ice mech of the Frozen Titans, and that works too, but I feel like the Mantis is also a better choice, and even Herald is a really solid choice too, because it allows you to use that particular mech in an offensive fashion at the front. This will be expanded on in a different video. Another consideration is if he loses his shield and then takes on fire or somehow otherwise takes damage, such as blocking, then he can be out of the fight unless you have some kind of way to bring him back. And then once you do so, he won't get his shield back for the next turn. So he's more often than not a liability, but he can be a very powerful pilot with the right hands. I really only use him in the cannon mech of the Riftwalkers. I don't really care for him elsewhere, as his 1 hit point means he can't eat some damage and then block afterwards. So for the most part, I would recommend picking Kazakh Lepeth, Herald, or Archimedes for the Steel Judoka without grid defense. And if you get +1 move and +1 reactor, then put the reactor upgrade into hit points so you can block or eat a small amount of damage early on. Let's move right along to the upgrade path I use. The subject of upgrade paths is a difficult one for sure, something I struggled with when I first picked up the game and started to work on the more difficult squads. As I mentioned earlier, a video will be coming out soon which will expand on the subject for the other squads, so I encourage you to check that one out. Anyways, with the Steel Judoka, I have found that the first power core should go into the siege mech's movement. The reason is that the artillery tends to be the star of the show, and 3 movement artillery is weak and doesn't allow for proper coverage. If by chance the pilot does roll a movement bonus early on, then I instead stick that power core into the hit point upgrade so he can eat a shot or 2 without clocking out. At the company store, at the end of the campaign, I have 2 immediate priorities. A decent weapon for the prime, of which the burst beam, titan fist, rocket fist, rock launcher, or even in a pinch, the flamethrower will work, but the latter needs to be swapped out for something more powerful as soon as possible. It is something that needs to get acquired. The next immediate priority is to get the buildings immune and damage upgrade on the artillery at all costs. You can get more mech pilots later on. Why don't we have a live narrated playthrough to see how this all works out? Right, here we go. We're going to play this normal mode, mostly because that's what I'm already familiar with, but we're also going to use Herald. So the reason I'm going to use Herald is because he's more likely a pilot or a character that you will already have access to. And if I choose one that you may not have access to, it doesn't keep things as accessible to some of you who might be watching this video. You're going to see me play kind of fast. This is because after a while it starts to become more or less instinct on how you play. Just like in Team Fortress 2, if you played Soldier for a while and you've more or less figured out the art of rocket jumping, you don't really think about it too much, you more or less act on instinct. So let's choose our islands. The first thing we're going to do is take a peek at which ones offer which opportunities. The first one is Archive Incorporated. This one appears to be manageable with the red Scion for healing the enemy Vec and the boss Hornet. That appears to be manageable just fine. The RST island is not so hot because the Alpha Scorpion tends to put a lot of control pressure on you. Camellia has a really good way of countering him, especially if she has a weapon that can push him away. She can bait him into a corner of something and then just push him out of trouble. The Blast Scion is also difficult for us to deal with because that particular Scion has to be gotten rid of a lot of times before anything else can be dealt with. The next island is the Pinnacle Robotics Island, which this one's okay. The Shell Scion I can kind of deal with. It does have 2-3 hit point enemies, so that basically become 4 hit point enemies, which can be a problem for me. Additionally, when all the little spider eggs come out, I can't really clear them off the field by just the artillery, so that could be a problem for us. The last island is Detritus Disposal. This island is okay as well, but the problem is that the Scion is going to be one that you have to kill off quickly, much like the bot leader, because every turn that he's on field just makes things more difficult for you. So we're going to go with Archive Incorporated. A lot of people like to go with Archive Incorporated without even looking at it first, and you'll see that in a tip on people who play on harder difficulties. And the problem with that is that it's not always the correct choice. It depends on what your squad can do and what you can output from it. In my first setup of this first turn here, what I'm going to do is put the Prime in a position to get the Leaper to attack him. And I want to put him in a position where if he gets grabbed, then he can defend himself. The Hornet is going to be a bit of a problem because Hornets have 5 movement, unless they're Alpha Hornets, and they tend to get into your backline and cause you a lot of problems with that. Another problem we have to deal with is the Dam. Unfortunately, my siege artillery only does 2 damage, so what I have to do is blow up the dam with either the artillery or pushing an enemy or a friendly into the dam to damage it. This next turn is pretty self-explanatory. The enemy scarabs have lined themselves up in such a position that they can be dealt with very easily by just the artillery. As you get the artillery fully upgraded, you'll find that it's actually one of the best artillery in the game. Sometimes if you find yourself in a position on this dam island, you can get yourself in a setup where the enemy will blow up the dam for you. This mostly works with like alpha fireflies because they do 3 damage when they fire, so they can just kill the entire dam for you. And you see at this turn right here, I'm trying to block because I still need to destroy the dam. I've already just killed all the enemies that I'm required to do, but I still need to destroy the dam. So I don't have a lot of time to do this. Oh no, not too bad. Let's continue on to the next mission and see what we can do. First thing I'm going to do with the power core here is put it into the movement range of the artillery. That's the first thing we have to do to make sure that he can get to where he needs to go. Now, one thing we like to do is have a little race between the judo mech of the Prime and the artillery, the siege mech, to try to see who can get an upgrade first. And whichever one rolls movement or hit points will go into the artillery spot, so that way it's a little bit more versatile. If a pilot gets grid defense, or they both get grid defense, they are instantly benched at the corporation store. In this next turn here, I want to make sure I get my mechs into the correct position for the turn after this to make sure I can maintain the initiative. In particular, I need to keep the Prime in a position where he can attack in at least 2 directions. And I want to keep the gravity mech with Harold's ability in a position where he can effectively push in any one direction without causing grid damage. So a good spot with that would be this D4 square, but I'm going to put him at D3 because I want to bait with him more. One thing you can do is you can use the prime, or it works better with the gravity mech with Harold, is you can use the push effect of the artillery and or Harold's push to kill enemies for you. And that's just basically pulling an enemy to your prime, or pushing an enemy into your prime, or pushing your prime into an enemy, something like that. So what I'm thinking about here in this turn is I'm looking at the leaper. I'm trying to figure out where he can go to, because I understand that he can get to the C5 square, he can jump to the B4 square, or the D4 square. So what I can do is, I don't want him getting into my back line, so I'm going to put a mech on C5 so that he cannot jump there. He has to then attack the D4 or B4 squares. And what that's going to do is that's going to force him to put himself in a position that he is disadvantageous. This is something that you see a lot of in chess, where you want to set up moves and combinations where the enemy is forced to do certain things that they don't want to have to do. This artillery is going to be a difficult spot because the corner of this island and the upper top part of this map here is interfering with my full control of it if I put it in a back line. And I can't do it off a side file either because it doesn't really work with that. Now the satellite launches is a bit like the Earth Mover platform, where the artillery of the Steel Judoka sorts out really well with it, but we have to make sure we deal with the situation properly. So my primary threat at this point is the Hornet, because he can put himself in a position in my back quarter here that is less than favorable. So we want to make sure that we have our mechs in a position that either forces him into a position that is advantageous for us, or puts him in a spot that he's not really a threat. Because he has 5 movement, we need to make sure that we contain him as early as possible so he's not a problem later on. Especially because we don't have buildings immune on the artillery, and the prime doesn't really have a way of dealing with things if things get in cramped quarters. You'll see I didn't block in this turn, even though I could have, and that's because I'm trying to get more experience onto the prime, but also I don't want to over block. I'm probably going to start blocking after this turn though. You can see that the push effect of Herald is very useful in a lot of different situations. In general, you'll find that he makes life with the Steel Judoka a lot easier, but not as easy as the Mantis does, because the Mantis has the ability to be able to simply kill things outright if he likes. But the only problem with that is that he doesn't have a way to heal. But if you have a hit point upgrade onto him, it's not really that big of a deal. In principle, if you want to win with the Steel Judoka, use the Mantis, but I tend to use Herald a lot of the times because I like it's somewhat of a challenge, and he makes it a little bit too easy. So now we're going to put the upgrade for the hit points onto our artillery, so that way he can eat a shot from like a Hornet or a Scarab or a Firefly without having to worry too much about his health being taken out of action. But also it allows us to bump enemies towards ourselves more often than if we didn't have the hit point upgrade. And forward movement, even on this map right here, is still adequate. So my primary thing here is I recognize that the Alpha Hornet doesn't actually have much of a way of attacking any of my buildings. So instead what I'm going to do is try to get him to attack my mechs on the D file. Now the regular Hornet here is actually really the only real threat here. The Alpha Hornet I can ignore for about a turn, but the Hornet in the F2 square is my primary problem that I'm going to have to deal with. We can cause significant damage to the Alpha Hornet by shooting it into his Blood Scion, but I think I have a better idea. One of the problems you can see here is that the Prime does not have any particular utility or option in this circumstance compared to a lot of other Primes. It means we're going to take some hit point damage, but I think we'll manage this fine. Mech hit points is a resource. You should not be afraid to use it if it gives you a much higher chance of victory. Unless you play badly, most of the time mechs won't go down. So now I need to block because I'm in a bit of a sticky spot. But I think I have a solution here. I'm trying to push the Alpha Hornet away from my backline, because the more he gets into my backline, the less options I have to deal with him. We got Armistice Artillery and Prospero for the Perfect Island rewards. I don't really think the Armistice Artillery is going to do me any good here, so I'm going to choose Prospero instead. And then right now I'm just looking for a prime weapon as soon as possible. And then I need to also upgrade my artillery to the max. If you do not get a good weapon for the prime by the end of Island 2, then just go right for a 2-island finish, because you won't have enough damage to be able to deal with the enemies in Island 3 and 4. The Fire Beam is not a great weapon. I don't think I've really ever used it in a full-on dedicated capacity, but it's better than the VEC hormones, in my opinion. You can see from what I was doing in that particular island that I didn't make use of VEC hormones at all. My thinking for the fire beam here was that I'm planning on doing the Pinnacle Robotics Island next, and with the fire beam, if an enemy is sitting on an ice square and you put the fire beam across it, you can cause them to sink because you will basically put the tile on fire, which can't exist, so he immediately sinks. So that's a bit of a better utility than the VEC hormones. There's a lot of debate in the Into the Breach elites about whether VEC hormones is a worthy upgrade, and I personally believe it's not. I'm going to elaborate on this towards the end of the video. Now you can see why I wanted to get the pilot upgraded to have movement on or reactor on the artillery, so that way I will have buildings immune, +2 damage, and 4 movement on the very next island. The only problem is I don't have the hit point upgrade, but I think we can still do just fine. Train missions. I always like to do train missions. I do them all day long. One thing that people like to tell you about is avoid train missions at all costs, and I like to try to do them instead. When I first took on the game, I avoided them as per the usual advice from the more experienced players. And if you're playing on hard, that's kind of true, but they're actually not that difficult. It depends on the topology of the map in this case. So this one is easy. This one is literally ideal because you don't have the little tunnel towards the end that enemies can get stuck inside. You don't have a building towards the front that can be a problem. So this one is ideal for a train mission. The key factors, you want to get a mech on the C5 square that will not only bait enemies in front of him, but can push an enemy away from the front of the train if he goes there. And there's a lot of enemies like this leaper that can get in front of the train. So you want something in front of it that can either kill it outright or can push it out of the way, even if it gets webbed. Another key point is if you block on train missions, they become extremely easy because the blocking helps you reduce the amount of potential enemies that you have to deal with. Because there's only 4 turns that you have to deal with on a train mission, if you block, then you make it a lot easier to deal with in the future. Device fist is another hot topic concerning the Steel Judoka. Advocates are quick to point out that it is the only weapon besides the teleporter that can move a hostile more than 1 square in 1 action, which is true, but in my opinion it is more of a secondary weapon. It requires an open square for it to reposition the enemy to, doesn't scale well as the enemy hit point count increases, as it can't kill more than 1 enemy per attack, and this doesn't have the punch of the other prime weapons. It is a good secondary weapon though, as it requires no power cores to online and can be handy from time to time. Ally Immune is an upgrade that is best ignored. Prospero is not a bad choice for the Judo mech, but I don't like him too much in general. He works best in artillery roles because it allows you to be more flexible on islands that have water or other kinds of obstacles in your backline. But I would not choose him as a time traveler choice. So what I'm doing now is thinking about what can this beetle go that's going to give me problems. How can I bait him into a position that allows me to control him? Because if he gets to my backline, I can't really kill him first turn because he has 4 hit points normally, plus 1 from the Scion. So he's basically an alpha. Nice, he would hit point upgrade, so I want something to give him something, but we'll just give him Beck hormones back because I got nothing else to put in there for him for an upgrade. You want to find out a setup that gives your mechs the most amount of options, and that's what Harold really brings to the gravity mech, is that he gives them something that he did not have before. In particular, the gravity mech a lot of times can only do so much just by pulling something. You really have to work overtime to try to make that ability actually worthwhile. I do keep it for later islands, but I don't use it that much, particularly if there's better options, such as a tank. Now, if I have a tank on the gravity mech, that just gives me a option to launch the tank first, and then follow up with attacks from the Mantis, and or pushing things around defensively or offensively with Harold as suitable. So basically with that, I have 3 particular options I can choose for any one particular scenario. The more options you have available to any one particular mech, the more likely you're going to be successful with your runs. If all 3 mechs have at least 2 options they can deal with any one situation, then it just makes things so much easier for you in the future. Fortunately, there's an easy pit that allows the prime to actually be useful in this situation, but a lot of times on a lot of maps, there's not such a convenient option for you. And this is basically a token example of when it does work. There's also a lot of cases where it doesn't work, and all he can do is just sit around and watch somebody else do all the killing for him. We got a power upgrade that has a rock launcher in it. This is a big deal for us now. We want to try to figure out a way that allows us to get this online as soon as possible, because not only does it give me ranged option, but it gives me additional damage against the endgame boss here. So with this particular setup, I want to put my mechs in a position that does not allow for this firefly to get in my back area or in between any of my buildings. I also want to try to encourage this silent boss to try to stay up front, where he's not really something that's going to be cramping my mechs, to set it up in a position where he is not much of a problem for my other mechs. I also want to get rid of him as fast as possible, because he makes other enemies heal. They also have 1 extra hit point, and they also explode on death. So the longer that he's online, the much more difficult it makes it for my prospects in the future. So this was an ideal outcome, because the extra damage from the prime allowed me to kill him with just 2 mechs. But I could have used my gravity mech in this situation if necessary, but it was a good thing I didn't have to do it. Now this alpha beetle is going to be a bit of a problem for me. I need to figure out a way to prevent him from getting into my back line. So I need to figure out how can I put him in a position where he's not going to be a problem for me in the future. And I think the solution is to try to figure out how to put him onto the G3 square, so that he will take out that firefly who already is in my back area. Okay, now he's in my back area as well, but I think there's a way I can get him to either push back forward or go off into the water. One problem right now is I have 4 enemies on field, plus the alpha beetle, so I need to figure out a way that allows me to deal with all of these. It turns out I only have to deal with 3 of these threats, but this could have gone very bad too. We were very fortunate that the scarabs chose not to attack any of my buildings. This is a prime example of the whole rebound effect that can happen. You can prevent it from happening by blocking. As you have seen, this squad is relatively capable, particularly with the artillery, and doesn't quite live up to the reputation that it has taken on from the community at large. It definitely does play differently than the other squads, but can hold its own without falling back to grid defense in most situations. Now, I said I would talk about VEC hormones a bit more. To keep VEC hormones or not is a bit of a debate, and I will let you make your own conclusion on the subject. The problem I have with the upgrade is that it doesn't tend to make a significant improvement in this squad's effectiveness. Neither does it scale well as the enemy count increases. In addition, in later islands, particularly in hard difficulty, it starts to taper off in its usefulness. That said, most games have some kind of killer upgrade or mod that significantly improves the performance of a character. For Team Fortress 2, gunboats are a staple of experienced rocket jumping soldiers. In Borderlands games, there's dozens of combinations of kit that synergize well together, such as the Rough Rider in Borderlands 2, which works well with Krieg and Sal. I will say that the first time I experienced the Flame of the Firehawk shield on Krieg was one of the most outrageous moments I've experienced in a video game. In Deep Rock Galactic, the special powder overclock makes a significant difference in the scout's mobility. You might be wondering if such a thing exists for Into the Breach, and in fact there is. For most squads, that would be the missile barrage, which is really good at getting you out of really sticky situations. but for the Steel Judoka squad specifically, the Force Amp is a perfect fit for this squad. I should point out that as part of making this footage, I ended up being forced to manually seed the company store with it because over 20 starts failed to include it, and runs with other squads have given me the overall impression that it is an uncommon upgrade. However, it is an excellent match for the Steel Judoka because the artillery attacks 4 squares at once, doing up to 2 base damage plus 1 additional possible damage from the push effect. Unlike Vec Hormones, which is a paltry upgrade from 1 base damage done to enemies, which gets upgraded to 2, the Force Amp means you can kill Alpha Hornets by bumping them into yourself. Diggers are easily taken care of as well, and the overall effectiveness of the artillery is increased. It's an upgrade that doesn't have much place on the other squads, and it's certainly debatable whether this upgrade should come with a Steel Judoka by default. So if you like the Vec Hormones, then let me ask you a question. If you found the Vec Hormones in the shop for another squad, particularly the Flame Behemoths, which is technically a better squad for repositioning enemies, would you buy it and put it on that squad over something else like the Missile Barrage or Boosters or a light tank? It's kind of doubtful. If you get this game, I'll afford you a couple of pointers, starting with upgrades. First point should go into Lex Mechanic tree, as cognition points are like your fuel, and lots of fuel means you can maintain an advantage over the enemy and fuel power-thirsty weapons. Next, you'll want the first point into the Dominus tree, as early on you'll be relying on pistols and you desperately need the range to deal with a Necron destroyer that can two-shot your tech priests. The best conservative build I have is this one, pretty much a cognition focus build that has a lot of quality of life improvements, particularly with the escape ability, which is critical for getting in and out of melee range. Full-on melee or range-only builds like these are possible too, but I have found that they're prohibitively expensive and don't do really all that much. On top of that, the full-on melee build can only attack once per turn, while my hybrid Lex Mechanic build can attack 3 times per turn, stab units for cognition points, refill the cognition gauge, has good tank and resists, and just lots of versatility. This Phosphor Serpenta is a great energy ranged weapon, and the Cognis Flamer is a solid lower powered ranged physical damage weapon. Don't be scared of the red troop encounters. They can be very good reward wise, but don't do them if you're weak. Destroy scanners after you scan them, if possible, and always prioritize Blackstone rewards. Check out this other website, which is a minor treasure trove of information concerning this game in general. As this game does not have a lot of info out there, you kind of have to learn on your own. For instance, Necron wearers have a range of about 10, have 4 movement, do 3 to 4 energy damage, have no melee weapon, but they can do opportunity attacks, which does only 1 physical damage, and typically have 7 to 10 hit points with up to 2 resistance of any one single type. You can cancel out of glyph events. There is glyph guides out there that if you really like the game, you should print out. It's a good game, but isn't as polished as Into the Breach. It takes about 30 to 45 minutes to do a longer length mission, so if you plan on busting it out in a day, that's not very realistic. It can be sometimes buggy, like Subnautica, and the UI needs more polish. In addition, the battle sequences cannot be interrupted, meaning that time when you find yourself cornered by 4 Nikon warriors and all your tech priests get shredded in the early game, it just might be that you get to literally do nothing while you watch your demise. Another thing is to take a full advantage of the Skitarii units whenever possible. Early on, you're only going to have the simple servitor, but you can make good use of them as meat shields and just to finish off enemies. But later on, you're going to want to replace them for other units, unless you prefer a melee-focused Skitarii build. The Skitarii Vanguard and the Skitarii Ranger are excellent units, especially when they get to the level 2 upgrade, because the level 2 upgrade on the Ranger means you can disable a dangerous enemy's weapon for 1 turn, and the Vanguard can fire an additional time. That is very powerful. I would not recommend buying the Heretic DLC, as while it is okay, it doesn't really give you as much as you might think, and some of the stuff in that DLC is not really worth the cost on it. If you like the game, buy the DLC, sure, but if you just want to experience the game by itself, you don't need to buy the DLC with it.